Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Terry Fisher. I'm from NQA. I'm the Principal Assessor for OHSAS Management Systems. We're looking today at a webinar on the migration of 18,001 to ISO 45001. As we go through the presentation, if you want to ask any questions, you can type them into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. Then I'll be able to view the questions and then we'll either answer them as we go or we'll answer them at the end of the question and answer sessions. Can someone just confirm that they can hear the audio okay? Thank you very much for that. Right. So without further ado, we'll move into the presentation. So firstly, why would you be looking to implement 45001? What are we trying to achieve by that? Well, primarily, we're trying to improve OHS performance of the management system. We're trying to improve culture, which may involve cultural change, building on existing risk-based thinking and worker engagement. We're looking for a systematic approach to reduce culpability and give protection to workers and the organisation. We're also looking for a proven commitment in relation to leadership, action and continual improvement. We're also looking at statutory legal compliance, which is one of the core elements of 45001, as it is with most management systems. As some of you may be aware, if you're familiar with 9001 and 14001, the introduction of 45001 in the ISO management system structure is following the same Annex SL structure within the 10 elements. From an operational and systems point of view, we're interested in sections 4 to 10. The first 3 sections of the structure of Annex SL refer to the standard itself. So they're looking at the scope and application of the management standard, the normative reference of the management standard, and the terms and definitions used within the management standard. Now, section 3, the terms and definitions, is quite a useful reference point for those of you new to standardization and standard management systems. With regard to the requirements for clients, as I say, we're looking and we're interested in the context of the organisation in section 4, section 5, the leadership, section 6, planning, section 7, support, 8, operations, and 9, performance evaluation, which should naturally lead to corrective and improvement actions and continual improvement of the management system going forward. So, we've already spoken briefly about what we're trying to achieve, the cultural change and the improved OHS performance of an organisation. The context is looking at external and internal issues relative to the activities and the purpose of the organisation. It's also looking at the interested parties, the legal requirements and regulations, and the commercial considerations of those interested parties and how the organisation performs those requirements, how it reacts to its own internal and external issues. And basically, we're looking at why it does what it does in the way that it does it. and what influence that can have on OHS performance. Section 5 of the standard looking at leadership, so it's looking at strategy, policy, roles, responsibility, and a core element of that is the participation of workers within the management system. Section 6 looks at the planning, so the hazard identification, the risks and opportunities which may come about from understanding the context of the organisation and the interested parties. The compliance obligations that are applicable to the organisation, and the OHS objectives that will be set and required within the management standard. Section 7 looks at the resources and the competence and awareness of staff and workers, the communication between those groups and the interested parties, and the documented information required throughout to demonstrate compliance. It also looks at the hierarchy of control, the management of change, procurement, contractor control, and emergency preparedness in Section 8. Section 9 and 10 are looking at the evaluation and improvement, so internal audit, management review, incident and corrective action, improvement objectives and deliverance of, and in the improvement process generally throughout. So the starting point of the management system wants to identify the scope. So to help you identify the scope and applicability of the management system, you first need to understand the context. So who are the interested parties? What are they interested in? And what's the strategic direction and etc. and the leadership requirements of the organisation will help you determine the scope of applicability for your management system, so the context of the organisation. So if you think of a range of examples here, you know, a water company, a public limited company will have a very different context to potentially a university. A food manufacturer will be very different again, and a family-owned engineering business may well have a very different organisational context in relation to those types of things. I'm just using those as examples. Obviously, there are numerous types of organisation, and the context potentially will be unique to that organisation. It may be doing something very similar to other people and other organisations. However, I guarantee that organisation will have a unique set of circumstances that influence that and its ability and requirements. So the context is very much looking at why the organisation exists, what it's trying to achieve, and how that can impact on the workers within the organisation and also workers outside the organisation, considering people like subcontractors, etc., and people potentially down the supply chain. So we deliberately use the term workers, not just employees, because workers refers to somebody carrying out an occupational activity, and it isn't necessarily just directly for employees. As I said, every organisation is different, and conditions, external and internal factors and its interested parties will be unique to them. So the context of the organisation primarily is looking at understanding the organisation, what it does, why does it do it, who are the interested parties, what are they interested in, and how can you identify when you've delivered that interest, etc., whether you've met that need. It also looks at risks and opportunities. But in the OHS system, the core interested party that you're looking at is the workers. And as I say, those workers may be direct or indirect. That's the core party you're trying to protect, but there may be other interested parties such as stakeholders, owners of the business, etc., enforcement agencies, to name but a few. All this needs to be understood and determined before you can identify the scope of the management system. And the scope must be documented. It must explain what you're applying, where the system is being applied to over the range of the organisation. And there's a general requirement under 4.4 of the context to look at the management system and the continual improvement and development of that management system. First question is, there's a requirement for establishing and function of health and safety committees under 5.1. Does this need to be implemented formally, or can other mechanisms be used within the organisation if the organisation is only small in number, i.e. 12 employees? The means of communicating with employees and participation can take many and varied requirements. The structure and appropriateness needs to be determined by the organisation. It's looking at how effective that is. It's looking at an effective mechanism rather than necessarily a formal structure, but you will need evidence to be able to support that other than just making a claim. So there will need to be documented information as to, you know, meetings or whatever, who's attended, what things were discussed, etc., etc. So there will need to be some formal output, even though the undertaking may be done on a less formal basis. Hopefully that answers the question on that's just been asked. So when you're considering the context of the organisation, you need to consider the various factors, and you can use many varied methods for this, looking at PESTEL analysis, looking at the way the strategy of the business, the structure, the style of the organisation, the staff, the skills, the systems that's already available within the structure. There's many models that you can be used to help you identify some of the context elements that are required within the standard. So the context is a common element of 45001 in association with other management standards that have been recently revised within the ISO management system suite. I'm using the two most common here, 9001 and 14001, one being quality management, one being environmental management. But you can see context is a common element there throughout. You can only define the scope of the management system when the boundaries and applicability of the management system have been established. So it can only be defined after the context and the workers and interested parties have been identified. If we move on to leadership now in section 5, the emphasis is on leadership, not just management, and that's been a deliberate change. So it's not just about appointing resource in terms of management roles and responsibilities, but it's on about true leadership and the participation both of the leaders and the workers to make an effective system going forward. It's looking at the culture of the organisation, this joint participation and engagement with the work is as appropriate throughout all elements of the management standard. The system requires leadership to produce a policy which must be available in documented information. And within that policy, it talks about various commitments, compliance with legal obligations, commitments to safe and healthy working conditions by prevention of work-related injury and ill health, not just the reaction to that. And it looks at not just accidents, but injury and ill health. So we're talking about occupational well-being in the round, not just physical injuries, but it could be mental, fatigue, various things, stress, all the ergonomically injuries that can take time. So it's not just talking about direct incidents and accidents relating to cut fingers, etc. Talking about the overall well-being of employees and staff and workers at all grades within the organisation. Within the leadership clause, the organisational roles and responsibilities and authorities must be documented. People must understand what their role requires of them, what they're permitted to do, what they're authorised to do, what levels of authority are appropriate for the various functions within a company. It's also a key requirement to look at consultation and participation of workers and looking at mechanisms and removal of barriers in terms of organisational culture. So it's not about blame, it's encouraging people to participate, encouraging people to say, I don't think that's safe, make suggestions, communicate effectively with those authorised and responsible to take action, etc. So it's not just a management system, it's about the participation of the people that are actually undertaking the tasks and the workers within the organisation to ensure that that is effectively delivered throughout. Just got another question here. Does the external factors need to be documented and presented to the external auditors, since most of them are considered confidential and or secret? As part of an assessment, we will want to talk to senior leadership directly. That could be as part of a confidential interview. Some businesses document their strategic aims and interested parties and considerations, and that may well be a confidential information. Within an audit generally, there is a confidentiality agreement between yourselves and ourselves. Some of that can be disclosed, and if that's not the case or it's not appropriate, then a discussion with the leadership via interview, we will then take the findings of that and look for evidence of that being supported outside within the organisation. So if the leadership of an organisation declare that they're doing various things within an interview, a confidential interview, we may not declare that interest directly outside then and go, oh, I want to see, you know, the policy on whatever. We will go and look for supporting information outside within the organisation to demonstrate that that's been effectively implemented throughout the organisation without necessarily linking it to the strategic direction of the business. Hope that answers the confidentiality question. So the consultation of workers and the various things. Also looks at the time and resources. So it's about leadership time and resources, resource time with employees and staff, giving people not just the resources and in terms of equipment, but time to perform their duties, etc. within their roles. Information, communication and training, what you need, why you need it, where you currently are, where you want to get to, and development of skills and training and knowledge and understanding, etc., in relation to workers to enable them to participate effectively within the organisation. Non-managerial participation in the identification of hazards and controls in the establishment and various elements of the standard system, including potentially the policy and the various things there. So it's not asking you to get ratification by the employees for a policy statement, but it's looking for some involvement, some consultation to say, this is what we're looking for. Has anybody, it's that general communication and participation that's required. We want workers at all levels, and it includes management roles and all other roles, whatever the structure of the organisation, to engage with the whole of the management system. So it isn't just seen as, oh, that's so-and-so's job. The whole organisation needs to be engaged within the process to make it effective. When we're looking at planning, so we're looking at the identification of hazards and risks, and we're also looking at the hierarchy of control as it's applied within the management standard. So the hierarchy of control is demonstrated there in the form of an inverted triangle. The blue levels at the top are the most effective, and as you work down the triangle, you get down to administrative controls and PPE, which are the least effective mechanisms of control. So therefore, they should be considered later in the process once you've considered whether you can eliminate, substitute, and engineering controls are the three core most effective activities. Within that, you're also looking at hazards and risk identification and actions to address risk and opportunities within the management system. So ideally, as we say, eliminate the risk, substitute it, engineering controls. This is where the hierarchy of controls becomes a really important mechanism to looking at risks. And also, you've also got to consider by implementing or changing a control, you may introduce other hazards that previously weren't there. You may change a working method or a working practice, which may in itself introduce different hazards and risks, and they need to be considered before you implement the change, because you need to control those risks and bring them into an acceptable level. Otherwise, you could be making the situation worse. I'm just looking at a question that's been posed. Question is, do you need to document all interested parties, perhaps by industry type, or would clients be sufficient? In terms of, it's a generic statement. We don't want a list of every customer or client or whatever. It's a generic statement indicating what types, but you may want to then expand on that because, saying enforcement agencies, for example, there may be a particular requirement that you need to do things because of a statutory obligation. So you may want to, and it's how that links and what influence that has. So the level of detail that needs to be appropriate for that requirement based on what the interested parties are and how significant that interest is and what the potential it has on the management system. Another question is, does the admin control here mean what's used to as disciplinary actions No, we're talking administrative controls being safe systems of work, documented procedures, etc., etc. The reason that they become potentially less effective is because people may not adhere to them. And people being people, you know, you can give them the advice of don't do it that way, do it this way. So they can be potentially less effective. And this also then reflects on the culture, whereby knowing that any deviation from an agreed procedure or process control could result in disciplinary action in extreme cases, but it's also about the culture of, well, where we can, we'll try and eliminate the risk, substitute the hazard, and control it by other methods other than just administration. Because, for example, at different times of the day, the culture of the organisation may change. Let's say outside normal office hours when there may be less supervisory or management staff available. The culture of the organisation may change and they may not follow all the procedural and administrative controls that are in place and may be adhered to. But the true culture of the organisation is reflected at, let's say, 10 o'clock at night or 2 o'clock in the morning for the different types of activities. So therefore, just having a procedure doesn't necessarily make it an effective control. That's what's meant there with regard to procedural controls. So hopefully that's given you some idea. What we're trying to achieve in essence in the planning is to achieve the objectives of the organisation, address the risks and opportunities, meet legal compliance obligations whilst engaging with the workers to ensure that that is an effective method that we're applying and deploying each time. That's the primary core of the planning of the system. So if we look at each clause individually, actions to address risks and opportunities. You can see there we're looking at hazard identification and assessment, not just of risks, but also of opportunities, because you may think, oh, there's an opportunity, we can get better there, but you then must evaluate that opportunity because it may bring with it, as I said earlier, different hazards or different risks that you may have not considered or may not be relevant to the primary issue that you've got at the moment, but it could still be an improvement, hence why it can be an opportunity. And the determination of legal and other requirements. Obviously, that's the statutory requirements that could be applicable within an organisation, and it talks about determining applicable, relevant legislation and information that the organisation chooses to subscribe to. So there's the statutory stuff, which you don't have an option. If it applies to you, then it's applicable and you don't have an option. There are other things under other requirements that the organisation may choose to subscribe to, and that may be a code of practice, it may be an agreement with unions or whatever, it could be an agreement with worker groups. All sorts of things can come into the other bracket. So it isn't just talking about mandatory legislative requirements, it's talking about other requirements, and they could come from within the organisation. A higher level, a group requirement is that you do a particular thing in a particular way. These are all the things that need to be considered and identified as applicable to the organisation. And then you need to plan to take action. That's the key. In 6.2, we're looking at OHS objectives and planning to achieve them. So you need to set objectives. These objectives could be based on strategic needs, so it's something where you want to get better, based on historic performance or whatever. It could be based on risk assessment. It could be based on actual performance in a particular area regarding incidents and accidents. Or it could be you want to introduce different practices based on a commercial need and you want to ensure that that goes smoothly, etc., to ensure there's no new or uncontrolled risks introduced that are outside the system. So it's looking at setting objectives and targets and plans to achieve them, so which is the expansion on the previous 18,001 requirements, whereby you do need to start looking at plans, who's going to do what, when they're going to do it by, what they're going to do, how you're going to know whether that's been effective or not, is a critical element of planning for objectives. And it's also a critical element of any corrective and stroke improvement action that you need to undertake. Within the Plan, Do, Check, Act methodology, I would say that risk assessments are one of the core drivers for the organisation system, as is compliance requirements, as are leadership and strategic requirements of the business. Those three things help to drive the fundamental drivers of the business related to the context of the organisation. So there, you've got a policy statement from the organisations, which is a requirement of the standard. You need to set objectives. You need to put controls in place in relation to risks. You need to review the effectiveness of those controls, and you need to take action to improve them where appropriate and where you can. And that's the cycle of the Plan, Do, Check, Act in relation to risk assessments. In section 7 of the standard, in essence, this section is centred on communication, and leaders of the organisation need to provide resources, information necessary for the establishment, maintenance and continual improvement of the OHS management system. That's a very nice sentence, but in real terms that can be broken down into more bite-sized chunks, and the support functions are looking at the resources, the information, the training, all equal support and activities within the management standard. So the actual clauses themselves look at resources, the needs and requirements of that organisation, both in terms of workers and or the equipment that they use, etc., and the facilities that are required. It looks at competence of workers, including external workers and contractors, which could include the procurement process in relation to how that competence needs to be defined and identified. Awareness, including the ability of workers to remove themselves from situations where they consider present an imminent and serious threat to life or health, and protecting them from undue consequences for doing so. So this again is coming back to leadership and the culture of the organisation, whereby staff are actively encouraged to participate and identify high-level risk and all sorts of levels of risk within the organisation, and all those should be treated with credibility and sensitivity, not just ostracised because, oh, he's an awkward worker or they're an awkward worker for bringing these things to our attention on a regular basis. So it needs to be sensitively managed so that people are encouraged to engage with the process, not just ridiculed or chastised for bringing things to the attention of responsible staff within the structure of the organisation. It's a key element of an effective management system is the culture of an organisation, and all these things are building blocks to help develop a positive, open culture for an effective management system. Also looks at communication. They expanded to it from 18,001 to look at external, internal, what should be, and some requirements there for retaining as documented information various types of communication. So you need to have records of how you dealt with this. You also need to consider how you will communicate, who you will communicate to, when, will that be effective, how will it be measured, etc. So there's quite a few things in there that within the management standard have been expanded on from the previous version. 7.5 looks at documented information. This is traditionally document and record control, We've used deliberate changing terminology there. Documented information can be anything within an organization. So it's not just talking about hard copy documents. It's talking about data, information, all sorts of things that would be available within an organization. Certain things need to be suitably controlled to ensure that they're using the right version, or they're using the same operating instructions consistently across let's say a shift system. It's important that various controls are applied. They also need to be approved, and you need to understand what controls are being applied, and that needs to be managed effectively throughout the organization. So that's nothing new really, but the documented information can also relate to software and media applications, because some software and media applications may be the process control for a particular activity. A lot of plant and equipment now is run from a program. The program controls the on-off, the open and closing of this, the doing of that. So that version control of that software could be a critical path of control in relation to that activity or that operation. So that must be controlled in the same way as documented information should. I'm just looking at a question here. The question is, will the slides be available for download? Well, all those of you that are registered participants of today will all be sent electronically a copy of the presentation. So you'll get the slides so you can view again in your own leisure. So all the previous sections were looking at the management system and the various things that are needed to, and section 8 looks at the operational control. This is, in essence, the doing. And the organisation needs to plan, implement and control and maintain processes needed to meet compliance obligations and manage risks effectively, both for its interested parties and deliver the benefit of the management system. Okay, so it can also mean including maintaining documenting information and changing processes and procedures and various things in relation to the requirements of the workers. Yeah, so it's not just saying things need to stand still and we'll always do it this way. It means there can be changes in technology, changes in workers' needs, changes in workers' abilities, etc., that can all influence the operational planning and control. So it's an exchange of information across the various groups, and that needs to be understood and worked through, and it needs to be planned and controlled to eliminate hazards and reduce risk. Also needs to consider the management of change, which could be a change in process. So you could be introducing new process technology. It could be a change in staffing. It could be, it's holiday season, so therefore you've got a different crew that are not as familiar running a particular operation as the crew that does it routinely day in, day out. Could be new trainees being introduced. There could be language issues. There could be, so there's all sorts of things that need to be considered in relation to operational control. That needs to be looked at under the management of change. And procurement now includes a general requirement for procurement. It looks at contractors and outsourcing requirements. Basically, the procurement process needs to be effective in relation to, it could be some technical compliance requirements of a particular service provider. There may be statutory obligations that provider must have before they're legally allowed to work on a particular type of system. Gas is an example there, for example, as a simple example. And some procurement processes may not include that currently, and it needs to link to the statutory requirements and look at competence. So there needs to be this in-feed of the procurement process, not just a matter of, well, we've got the cheapest supplier who's available tomorrow. They may not necessarily be competent to do that. I'm not saying they will or they won't, but you need to have a method of be able to verify that competence prior to engaging that contractor or that outsourced requirement. You need to ensure that it will deliver the benefit. And in 8.2, it also looks at emergency preparedness and response. So this is foreseeable emergencies, things that can be identified via risk assessment, etc. Standard things being fire. Within normal workplaces, there's always some consideration towards fire evacuation, etc. Because there's a legal requirement to do that, and most businesses and commercial activity have got that well and truly understood. And it's a matter of making sure that those are considered. And it's not just emergency situations. It could be abnormal situations whereby if something breaks down, a key piece of equipment breaks down, for example, extraction system, may introduce different hazards because that's broke down. You may not be able to run all the processes you could previously because an extraction system. So it's looking at the planning and activity of both the normal sort of everyday activity and the emergency activity and some potential stroke abnormal activity that may be brought about there. So that's basically the operations. In section 9, we're looking at performance evaluation. Having carried out the activities within clause 8, it's time to monitor, measure, analyse and evaluate the OHS performance. So basically, monitoring measurement, as the standard has been developed from its various draft stages, there's been a lot of changes in relation to the monitoring and measurement and the wording thereof. So generally, the evaluation needs to be retained. Monitoring and measuring what will be monitored, what will be measured. Information needs to be available so that it can therefore be followed. You know, we're going to measure this, we're going to monitor that, we're going to do this, we're going to do it at whatever frequency. And also, as well as general monitoring and measurement of performance, there's also the evaluation of compliance, which comes back to the statutory and other requirements that we talked about earlier. This is a key element of the management system. There's just having a legal register and knowing what you should be complying with is not compliance. That's knowledge of, and you need to confirm and identify a range of measures that will confirm that you are thus compliant with that requirement. And that, as I say, can be many and varied, but it's a key element of the legal compliance process. It's a key element of policy in relation to legal compliance, and it's a key element of management review when it comes to looking at the performance of the management system. As part of that evaluation and that analysis and that monitoring, we may well use internal auditing, and internal auditing is a very powerful tool for confirming that we're delivering what we think we deliver, and it's confirming that we're meeting that need, and it also confirms that the controls that we've got in place are being effectively implemented. So it's a very powerful, potent method of analysing the performance of a management system. And the management review itself is looking at the management review of the system in its entirety. So right the way through from the resources, the policy, all the various things, internal audit actions, context of the organisation, changes in statutory stuff. It's looking at the overall performance of the management system and the delivery of the objectives and targets of the organisation. So it's not a routine operational review. There are elements that may be contained within your routine operational review that may be then summarised or detailed in the management review, but it's very different to an operational review that may take place on a routine basis, let's say monthly, from an organisation. So a management review is looking at the overall performance of the system and where improvements can be identified, both based on risk and performance analysis, and where you think actually that didn't work as well as we thought, or etc. We can change the way we do things. We can change, put different resources in, whatever that change may be, apply more training, etc. It's a very powerful model to look at, and it's a requirement that it must be undertaken at planned frequency to look at the effectiveness of the management system. So that then brings us to section 10, the final section of the revised standard. This is looking at non-conformity, incidents and corrective action. So information must be retained as to what the non-conformities were, what the corrective actions were, and then there are requirements specifically about corrective actions, who was responsible, when was it implemented, was it effective? And the only way to know whether it was effective, it must be reviewed. So all the actions, just implementing a corrective action is not a review of its effectiveness. You could implement something and it may not deliver the benefit that you thought it was. It may not deliver the reduction in risk or the elimination of the hazard. And so therefore it may need to be reviewed. Was it effective? Yes, no. And then if no, then obviously re-looked at. And as I've said before, it's a change. So therefore that action may introduce other risks that weren't considered or weren't identified initially when it was being implemented. And so you need to review it for those sorts of elements as well. You know, it could be, oh, well, now it's very awkward to do another process because you've now put that in the place of whatever, which is something that wasn't identified at the initial change point. So you need to review actions for effectiveness. Continual improvement should be a natural output from all the other elements of the management system. So if we follow all the other sections 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9, continual improvement should come as a natural output from the management standard. It shouldn't need specific consideration. One of the things that's often found difficult is how to demonstrate continual improvement. We'll often go into organisations and say, well, how have you continually improved your... Well, you know, things like objectives and targets and achieving them and doing training and risk reduction are all continual improvement activities. So just bear that in mind. If you're asked the question, this is the sort of thing. It shouldn't be difficult to demonstrate continual improvement. As I say, if you've embraced all the other requirements of the management standard, it should be a relatively straightforward process. So, as I said earlier, key thing, the culture, the leadership of an organisation is a key driver for and the strategic direction of a business. Organisation is a key driver within the management model, as well as risks and compliance obligations, and it should be considered one of those key drivers when you're looking at the effectiveness and how the management system functions. That leadership has got to consider the internal and external issues and the context of the organisation, the needs and the expectations of relevant interested parties. It should enhance performance, it should protect workers, it should engage with workers, participation should be encouraged, culture should be improved, and it should fulfil and satisfy compliance obligations, not just statutory ones, but those of relevant interested parties, let's say stakeholders, etc. So, how do you make the migration from 18,000 to 45,000, well, you might want to undertake an external gap analysis. NQA have written various documents to help you through this process. For existing clients, there is a client gap guide that we've produced, which is available. You may want to do a less formal activity and undertake your own internal gap analysis. There are some subtle differences to the requirements of 18,001 and 45. So 45,001 has been published as from March of 2018, but it's still available until March 2021, which is its planned withdrawal date. Those of you who are already committed to implementing a management standard, by all means continue to implement 18,001, but also you may want to consider the requirements of 45,001. The two things are not contradiction in terms. 45,001 enhances the requirements of 18,001 and fits into the structure applicable to other management standards which may be applicable within your organisation. But by all means, those of you with an existing 18 or those who are on the verge of implementing 18, carry on. It's still got a lifespan until March. Those of you who are just starting the process, then consider implementing 45,001 because obviously that's the replacement and it will give you more longevity. It doesn't have a withdrawal date, and you may be pleasantly surprised at how much is already in existence within your organisation. During an assessment process, there are revised requirements there, and these have been introduced by the IAF, which is the global body which enables UCAS and everyone to issue UCAS approved certificates. So as a global requirement across all OHS standards, both for 18 and 45, there is a requirement to introduce and communicate with the management legally responsible for the health and safety system, personnel monitoring employee health within the system, and worker representatives with responsibility for OHS within the management system. So whether you've got an existing 18 system or you're looking to introduce 45, that requirement will be applicable to both standards, and that's been introduced as of January 2018. So that won't be dictated in any copies of 18,001 or 45,001, but it is a requirement for the global industry. It's not an NQA requirement, but obviously NQA have to implement that requirement. So you'll see a requirement there during the assessment process being introduced of all those people that need to be interviewed and attend the closing meeting. And if they're not available for any particular reason, then appropriate resources need to be made available at a later date, whether it be a telephone interview or whatever, to make sure that this participation and engagement and the output of the assessment process has been communicated to the relevant people that can influence how its performance is driven going forward. So as I say, that's not written in the standard, but it is a requirement that is introduced within the assessment process, both for 18 and 45. NQA requirements, as I say, we've also completed a client migration gap analysis document, which all clients are required to complete prior to any migration assessment from 18 to 45. So that's available to our existing clients, and that will be provided to you via the scheduling process when you either tell us that you want to migrate or whatever, and then we'll send you the necessary documentation, and or it will be introduced towards the deadline and the migration period when notified to yourselves. So the gap analysis, NQA gap analysis document should be retained and ideally available in electronic format and completed in electronic format, and it must be available at the point of assessment for migration. So some practical tips. If you're starting from scratch, implementing the standard 45001, have available a copy of the standard. That may seem like an obvious thing to say, but you'll be surprised how many clients don't have available the standard requirements, so therefore it makes it very difficult for them to comply with it. Look at the sources of legal compliance information and other requirements that are already in existence within your organisation, and look at the mechanisms already in place. Review any hazard and risk assessments that is already established. The method, as I say, you may be pleasantly surprised at how much you actually do. And you can do an internal gap analysis to identify the improvement points, or you can have an external body such as NQA to come along at a cost and do a gap analysis for you. So as an assessor will come along and look at your management system and identify any weaknesses or best practice that you're implementing within your organisation as it stands prior to formal assessment. For existing clients with 18,001 and migrating across to 45, as I say, have available the standard. NQA don't sell the standard, but it is available from ISO. You'll need to purchase a copy. They're not free, unfortunately. And there again, you'll need to conduct the gap analysis document that's provided by NQA, but you can also do your own internal gap analysis in preparation for that, whereas that helps clear the mist as to where things are within the management system. And it can clarify how the actual thing works when you stand back and look at what you've already got within your management system. It's a very good tool, this gap analysis, to look at and clarify, oh, we've actually got that. Yeah, we do that over there, etc., etc. So it's just a mapping exercise of the management system ready for migration. And as I say, completion of the NQA migration gap analysis is a requirement, and that would need to be available to the assessment when it's conducted. So that's a very quick overview of the requirements of 45001 and some of the subtle changes that have gone in its development. It is, in my view, a very good flexible document. It should stand the test of time. It should integrate very well with the existing management structure. And the main thing about this, it's linking to workers and making OHS activity part of your normal operation, not, oh, well, we make widgets and we do some health and safety stuff. It's we make widgets in a safe and healthy, considered, managed way. That's the key message, to make health and safety part of the business management model, not an add-on or an afterthought. So just quickly checking the, I don't appear to have any additional. There's a question here. Is it only the slides that will be circulated or a certificate of attendance as well? No, it will just be the slides. We don't issue CPD type or certificates of attendance for this type of webinar. But you're quite welcome to use the slides as long as you recognise that they are NQA slides and the source should always be identified within a presentation or information. So thank you all for your attendance. I hope it's been of use. If you need any more help, there's just one last question. Any idea how many organisations have certified to ISO 45001 in the UK? Difficult to say at this stage. It's in its infancy, shall we say. A lot of organisations are booking their migration in. So because it's only been available since March of this year, it is, because of its commonality with other management standards, it is being embraced more comprehensively, I think, within various organisations. It's a natural addition to existing management structures. And a lot of companies are welcoming the fact that it is an ISO standard now, and that has given it improved credibility. So it is increasing its the need for that in the marketplace. So it is developing. I think that the take-up will become, I think one of the issues is potentially the transition date for 14,001 and 9,001 is September 2018. So everybody's concentrating on their management system and making sure they've gone through the transition and the various things if they haven't already done so. And I think after that, a lot of organisations are very interested in then including, even if they haven't had 18,001 previously, there are a lot of companies are very interested in introducing 45,001, certainly throughout the UK. So yeah, I think it has it's got the potential to be a very strong standard in relation to take up across various industries. So thank you for everyone that's attended. There'll be further webinars and various presentations, and so we can post out the slides to you. All our schedules for webinars. We also are introducing various workshops at various locations throughout the UK in the coming weeks and months about 45,001 and other standards. So if you need any support or information, then by all means contact NQA, and where we can, we'll be happy to help. We do a lot of this stuff free of charge, but obviously certain things like client gap analysis is a chargeable activity. So just bear that in mind, but you know, it can be a very valuable tool to give you the heads up regarding any weaknesses within your existing structures and management system. So always consider that. It can be very reassuring to get a gap analysis done and know what you need to focus on, because it can be, you know, most management systems, you're very busy doing your day jobs and it can be difficult to identify the wood from the trees sometimes. So if you need any help and support, come to NQA. Hopefully we never stop improving, and thank you all very much for your time.